All right, let's try this. Something different. So, a lot of people have been speculating about this in the last few days. There were some chat early on. Hello, Jenny. Welcome. There was some chat early on about the possibility of, well, more than a rumor, that Flight 171 from Air India crashed because of fuel starvation to the engines, and there was an initial focus, so to speak, that there could be an issue with the fuel control switches, so that could provoke the engine starvation, fuel starvation. Before we go any further, I need to do a disclaimer here. It's very important. I want to be upfront. So I'm not a pilot, nor am I an aviation expert. I'm an aviation enthusiast, just like you and the vast majority of people that like flight simulators. And I'm passionate about understanding what happened with any air incident, including Air India Flight 171. The information I'm sharing here is based on the preliminary report released by the Indian government, and of course my own research. I'm aiming to clarify some points and offer my perspective as a fellow aviation fan. This isn't a professional analysis, it's not up to me, and I encourage you to do your own research and consult the official sources that I can gladly offer you as well. And I encourage you to make your own conclusions. Search for the most accurate information and make your own conclusions. But and my goal here is to foster discussion, shed some light about this tragic event. It's not to provide any kind of definitive answers. I will approach this with the utmost respect and shared interest in aviation safety, respect for the victims, of course, but above all, with the utmost respect for the world of aviation and how things are developed and done. Now, with that being said, there have been some people out there that really have no respect. Hello, Mirsha. Really have no respect for truth. So they hear something and they start talking about it without actual knowledge of how these things work. And that's not what I usually do, and that I think most informed people also don't want to do either. So let's jump into facts. Let's first of all open the preliminary report itself, which is the basis for what we're talking about here, or we'll be talking about here. So here it is. This is the preliminary report. It's available online. I can share the link afterwards. So this was a Air India Boeing 787-800 that unfortunately had an accident in June 12, 2025, as it's been widely reported. The report is very short, in my humble opinion, but this is just, again, preliminary report. Oops, sorry. So we'll go past what is already known regarding the victims, regarding the airplane status. Sorry about that. Let me just did a little poo-poo here. So what is known, I won't beat the drums on it. What is needed to be known is that the incident was unfortunate, of course, and the incident resulted from a very disturbing event that unfortunately is not that well detailed in this report. Let's jump through those nasty pictures over there. We'll probably go back to one or two. I'll address some rumors that people without knowledge shared. I'll also take a look into some of the items that people said, oh, this and that provoked the accident. What is known is what's here. So this is the communications to the ATC, and of course what the flight recorders brought out, and this last few seconds actually, of the flight. So first of all, let's address the big elephant in the room, which is what really made the plane crash. As we've mentioned before, and it's been widely known, both engines were shut off mid-flight. We can see here the very last moment the plane was pictured leaving the airport. It's not the last video, but where is it? We just passed it. Here it is. So at this point, and you can see that the runway is right over there, and you can see here the plane is barely airborne for seconds. I would say it's probably airborne for about 10 seconds, something like that, maybe less. At this point the plane is already engineless. Why do we say that? Well, the CCTV footage we're looking at here, we can see that there's something called a ram air turbine getting deployed during the initial climb immediately after liftoff. So right after the plane took off, there is a clear picture. As you can see here, it's barely noticeable in this picture, but you can clearly see, if you know what it is, I'll show you, not on this plane unfortunately, but I'll show you what a rat turbine is and how it works. You can see here that just instance after takeoff, the rat is deployed. This means this is an automatic trigger. Of course, I'll show you what the QRH says, but eventually the rat is deployable, can or should only be deployed if there is a dual engine fail, or at least a malfunction that provokes its deployment. And given the fact that the plane the plane crashed without engines, we can pretty much say that the rat was deployed because the two engines were already off at this point. Why does this happen? Well, we'll get into that in a moment, but for the time being, this is the fact. The plane was probably less than 600 feet, or maybe a bit above 600 feet, while climbing, when below that altitude, the engines were cut off. And so the plane will, of course, by inertia, continue to climb slightly, but after some point, there will be no thrust to keep him up, right? So that much is what is known. Now, what caused that? Well, this is what the report says. The aircraft, up until this blue line here, everything above was absolutely normal. So the plane crossed the takeoff decision speed, or V1, achieved 153 knots indicated airspeed. Rotation speed was at 55 knots, and the plane just took off absolutely normal. But as the aircraft achieved a maximum recorded airspeed of 180 knots, and immediately thereafter, the engine 1 and engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff position. This is very important, one after another, with a time gap of 0.1 seconds. So I would say 1 second time gap, unless there's a missing comma here, unless it should be 0.1 second, but it appears it's just 1 second. So there was a The fuel cutoff switches were transitioned from run to cutoff with a gap of 0.1 second. This is, I'll show you, or I'll explain to you what this means in a moment. After which, of course, number 1 and number 2 will begin to decrease to its takeoff values, and the fuel supply engines was cut off, which is absolutely what these switches are for. Think of these switches like your electricity jumper, the jump switch. So if you go to your house's main switch, you turn it off, then you cut off power to everything in the house. So like an emergency, for example. So this is what exactly this cutoff will do. We'll get on. We'll show you what the cutoff switches look like. We'll talk about how they move, and we'll also talk about the possibilities of this happening. Now, this is very intriguing and almost mind-blowing, is that in the cockpit voice recording, so remember the 2 black boxes were recovered from this plane. One of the pilots is heard, so I'm sure they know which pilot it was, but they don't want to clear that out just yet. One of the pilots is heard asking the other, why did he cut off? So why did he move the switch from run to cutoff? Well, to which the other pilot responded, but it did not do so. Now, this second part here, it's something that we may never know why the other pilot responded like that. Was there intentions, or weren't there any intentions? Was the pilot being truthful or not? We may never know this. What we do know is that the act of positioning the switches one after the other is deliberate. The fact that one pilot reacted with asking why, and the other said he did not do so, we have to take it at face value that one asked why because he was surprised, and the other said he didn't do it because he probably didn't do it. Was there a mishap? We'll see in a moment if that's even possible. Could the switch be operated by accident? We'll also talk about that. But the point here is this is a deliberate action. All right, we'll see how could this happen without it being a deliberate action, although it will sound a little far-fetched, but it is possible. But we'll talk about it. Now, unfortunately, of course, the pilots tried their best, so we know that the flight recorder indicated that engine 1 fuel cutoff switch transitioned and cut off to run, and about 2 seconds later the inlet door began its operations, and after this, 2 seconds later, the engine number 2 fuel cutoff switch was also positioned to the run. So there was an immediate action to place them to run, both on engine 1 and engine 2. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough, and even though the engine number 1 did core decelerated, stop and reverse and started the progress to recovery, the same thing happened with engine number 2, but at this point it was kind of irrelevant. If with one engine, if they had one engine, it's quite possible they could recover the plane, although again the altitude was too low. But imagining that they had thrust in that engine, one single engine, these planes are designed to work with one engine, so if they recovered power and had enough altitude, yes, it's possible with just one engine, and then the other one would come to life, of course, but only one single engine could have helped. Again, they didn't have enough time. In fact, they didn't reply to the ATC when they called in Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. When the ATC asked, they didn't mention a call sign. So when the ATC got back to them asking the call sign, they didn't reply because unfortunately the plane had already crashed. So this is it, 15 pages of the report. If you want to, it's an interesting read, although the main points, I've already cleared them out. Now, there's one thing I need to talk about, which is which was the base for a lot of speculation out there, was how these planes work. How can the fuel cutoff switch be actioned like this, and why can they do it, especially in such a situation that could cause a crash? And of course, other myths such as why wasn't the landing gear retracted? Why wasn't the why were the flaps retracted? Which is something I've heard a lot online. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these questions and these declarations that I've been reading are based on. I don't want to offend anyone, but most of these things are based on ignorance. Now, in a good way. People don't need to know how a plane works. They just need to get on board and fly it, right? This is the job of a pilot. I'm not a pilot though. Like I said, I'm an enthusiast, and what I'm trying to I'll try to show you is debunk some of the myths and some of the ideas that we've been broadcast, and of course make sure that we only talk about the facts. Now, the first fact that we know about, and it's been mentioned many times, and this is not something that's acceptable these days, is that Air India, in general, especially in the later years, have been accused by passengers, mind you, not by official authorities, of having their planes apparently looking bad. So there are videos of people boarding planes that they're very rough, they're very dirty, they're very misused, if you want. Would that weighed in this discussion? Well, that's up for the final report to point out if there was an issue with, for example, maintenance that could have caused such an issue. Was maintenance bad on Air India? It's not up to me to decide that. It's up to the authorities to figure that one out. What I can say is that there is a reputation. Now, this is just a verbal reputation. There's nothing written that Air India does indeed have poor maintenance or poor standards. I'm pretty sure if they did have, they would not be able to fly to Europe, for example. So let's put that aside. It's not really a factor here. Of course, the final report will say something about it, I'm pretty sure. And if the final report does say that there was a mishap due to poor maintenance, for example, if that final report becomes public, then we'll talk about it. If not, we'll just have to imagine that there was a mishap. What caused the mishap? Was it a malfunction on the plane, or was it pilot error? It's not the point. All right, we just don't know. Let's not speculate, and I've seen a lot of people speculating, which is unfortunate, and it's not the point here. We just want to talk about what's written here, what are the facts, what's been discovered by the flight data recorder, and that's what's really important for this discussion right now. Now, let's talk about the first myth. First myth was, after people were seeing that famous video where you can see the plane passing by with the engines cut off, and you can clearly hear the ram air turbine. We'll talk about the rat in a moment. And they say the flaps were up. This is, of course, it's when people don't know the planes, they think, well, it looks like there are no flaps, so therefore the flaps were retracted in takeoff. So this is the 757-900. It's not the 800. The paint job is completely wrong, so I apologize. And what do you say? Would you say that there are flaps deployed on this plane right now? It's hard to say, right? But they are. There are flaps 5, which were the same flaps set for takeoff and are really standard flaps for takeoff. And if I zoom in, you can clearly see that these flaps are extended. They're not really that far away from the fuselage, from the main wing, but they are extended. If I pull the flaps up, you can see them move. Now they're up, and now you see that there is no gap. The angle, which should be 5 degrees down, is now 0, so the wing is flush against the main wing. Let's go back to flaps 5. So this is flaps 1, and now flaps 5. It's slowly coming down, and there it is. This is flaps 5. Can you tell? Can you give me a different? Can you really say from afar, especially from a video like the one we saw, can you really tell the flaps are down or up? The flaps were on the 5-degree position. Even in 10 degrees, let's put it in 10 degrees and have a look. Whoops, I think I overdone it. All right, it's coming up again, so flaps 1, 5, is 10. So wait for it to transition to flaps 10, which is 10 degrees down. Even if flaps 10, from that grainy, far away video, can you really say the flaps are down on this plane from afar? So yeah, it's hard to say from a grainy, far away video. But no, the flaps were deployed as they should from a landing position. We are told by the, sorry, was it good? Yeah, you could see it. I was worried that the report will be on the way, but it was visible. So also on the cockpit, where is it displayed? So we can see here where the cockpit, the flap position is displayed. So it's right here on the main ACAS. So there it is, flaps 5, and also on the lever, there's flaps 5. We can move to the side a little bit so you can see better. So this is flaps 5, and this is a mechanical lever, unlike, well, a mechanically locked lever. So unlike, for example, the Airbus, which is a positional lever without any locks, mechanical locks, it has internal I don't remember the word in English, but it has an internal locking system and you can click it to point. This one has, you really need to raise the flap and move it. So this is a general rule of thumb for what is safety, or what should be considered as safety equipment on board. Everything needs to be deliberate, and to raise the flap, let's do that. You need to, as you can see, it transitions from one position or another by passing over this brake here. As you can see, as it brakes, the flaps will mechanically move through these gaps, and it needs to be risen and lowered into position. And this, like I said, is a general rule of thumb in every Boeing. It's very different. It's not very different from other aircraft. It's just a mechanical. It's been like this since, I believe, since the 707. The flaps have not changed much on Boeing. So the first misconception was, well, the flaps were up on takeoff and therefore the plane stalled. That's a myth. It's been debunked. Another myth that's going to be debunked is the fact that the gears didn't work, the gear deployment. So when the pilots pulled the lever up, the gear didn't work. Well, we can see here on this preliminary report picture right here that the gearbox, the gear module was found with the down position. So there was never an intention to pull the gear up, which tells you something, actually. It tells you that the pilots understood they had an emergency on their hands and they did not retract the gear as it should after rotation, actually. So there's a clearance altitude, clearing the aircraft altitude, and gear is one of the first things you clear on the plane as per checklists, in order to allow the plane to accelerate. So the gear is a big spoiler, if you want. It's a big dragging device. So the first thing you do after the plane clears the ground, one of the first things is to raise the gear. So the pilots understood there was an emergency on board, and therefore the gear lever was left in the down position. So another myth debunked that was clearly shown on the report here is that neither the flaps were retracted, and they see that they found the flap handle in flap 5 position, just like we shown, and that the gear lever was never retracted, or at least we don't think it was retracted because it was found like this. And if you think about it, lowering the gear after all this happened, these are seconds. They didn't have enough time to do all these actions and still relight the engines or try to relight the engines. So retracting the gear will be the last thing in their minds, especially after a short period before after takeoff. But yeah, it's possible that they raised the lever but then lower it again. But there's no way the gear was in the up position like people claim. They tried to raise the gear and something happened, or they weren't following procedures, or they did follow procedures, ignored the fact the engines were down or something like that. I read a lot of crap these days. Another myth, or not a myth, but another question that was asked a lot of times was, why did they turn on the APU? Now, why would they need to turn on the APU? Well, the idea is that if you enter such an emergency, maybe turning on the APU to give you enough power to operate your aircraft would be a thing to be done. The APU takes a lot of time to spool up, so it's not a factor, I think, in what happened. Of course, they could have turned on the APU as one of the procedures. We'll take a look at the procedures down the line, and it's part of the QRH. But the APU power up takes a very long time to be effective to help the crew do anything on this plane. It's part of the procedures, and we'll take a look at the procedures in a moment, and you'll see that it's important. But again, why the APU isn't really needed to control the plane. The engines can be relit via windmill effect. Turning on the APU is a procedure because you need all the power you can get to continue on, but the ram air turbine will give enough power for basic functions on board. We'll talk about the RAT after this. So the other myth, which was not a myth actually, was the other thing that we've been seeing in the last few weeks were about the fuel cutoff switches. So there was some talk before this preliminary report was released that the investigation would circle around these infamous fuel cutoff switches. And when that talk came about, people were thinking, how could that happen? How would, the switches are positioned right here. I'll show you where they are. So there they are, the fuel control switches, or fuel cutoff switches if you want. They're positioned in a very centralized area of the plane. Let me pull this to the side a little bit. They're positioned in a very centralized, so they're right here between both pilots and in the throttle quadrant. And the idea was, if there was a mishap on these control switches, and it could happen, then these cutoff switches could just send the control to cut off power to, or in this case, cut off fuel for the engines. And in Boeing designed, and most planes actually, the fuel cutoff switches have always been in this position, or fuel control switches have always been in this position. They used to be like a linear system, like a knob that would need to go to travel between like a linear path from off to run. Airbus has a very similar knob logic for left and right engine, or engine 1 and engine 2 on Airbuses. but they all share one thing in common. It's a mechanical action. It's not like flipping a switch. Unfortunately, in this airplane I'm flying on Flight Simulator, the switches do move like a light switch, and it's not how it works. And I'm going to show you here a slideshow that I prepared. Hopefully I can get it to work, because last time I couldn't when I was testing this. Here it is. So this is, by the way, the airplane. So this is an Air India 787-800. The one I'm flying here on Flight Simulator is a 900. I couldn't fly an 800 model in time for this video, so I apologize. But let's talk about the switches. So this is I'll go back to that image. So this is the switch. I'm not entirely sure this is the exact switch from a plane. I'm confident this is a simulator switch designed to work like the real one. And I want you to pay attention to, let's zoom in a little bit, to this area here. This little well, my cursor isn't showing, and I want you to pay attention at the root of the cursor. The root of the switch, and you can see that there's like teeth. This is the stopping system, so this is a locking system. So in whatever position you want to put it, either cut off or run. We're not sure on this picture how or where it's positioned at, but in either position, you come to understand that you cannot just flip it. You need to pull it out and then flip and pull it in or push it in. Or you can just release it because it's spring action. So that means that in order to move this switch, there needs to be a deliberate action. Again, a deliberate action to pull the switch, move, and release. There is no way like a sleeve would get stuck on this switch and move it up or down in this case, and it's even less possible that both switches could be actioned the same way by accident, and one after the other with a distance of 1 second. It's just not mechanically possible. Not only were these switches designed to be very sturdy, they're very sturdy switches. I've pressed a couple of real switches in my life. Even the Airbus one, which is a lot bigger, I can show you what the Airbus looks like in a moment, but even the Airbus one does require some strength. Not much, but enough to make it deliberate. Let's say you're operating this plane and you have a long sleeve or something, you can get stuck on this switch, and yes, one switch can be pulled. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very unlikely that both are pulled, one after the other. This is how the switch looks. This is a light test. Again, I think this is from a simulator, but it's similar to the real aircraft as much as it can be. But I wanted to show you how they look like in the cutoff position. And this is a fire test warning, a fire test being conducted, so that's why they're lit. And this is something I took off. I don't quite remember where, but it's not credited, so I'm sorry. But you can see there where both switch as the stop lock mechanism, like I was talking about, on both of them. And not only that, it also has a guard bracket, so they're protected by the guard bracket as well as the mechanical stop lock mechanism. And again, like this illustration shows, it's designed not to allow, accidental movement. So coming back to that first, this one. This is an entire module. So a lot of people were saying that what if there was a mechanical issue or an electronic issue? Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture from the area beneath the throttle quadrant module. This is the entire module, so the switches are not independent. They're inside this module. and the entire module controls the engine thrust or throttle in this case, plus the two cutoff or fuel control switches. Inside this module there are two channels that feed the entire system. So this means that if one channel fails or has a malfunction, there's another one for redundancy. Just like anything else in the world of aviation, there are redundancies. The likeliness that this entire system fails, once more, it's unlikely. Oh, well, pardon the redundancy, but yeah, you know what I mean. So the system is redundant. There are two channels, different separate channels for the operation of this throttle quadrant. And again, if one channel fails, the other will kick in, and even if both channel fails, the throttle won't work, for example. But even if the throttle won't work, the cutoff or the fuel control switches would never cut off one after the other. If the system failed, well, I can say never, but you know, it's unlikely that one failed after the other with a separation of 1 second. It can happen. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I don't know if these things are designed. If one fails, the other can fail right after. It doesn't sound correct. But even if that was the case, if the entire module would fail, the two redundancies fail. So again, unlikely, but possible. Of course, they run out of engine power, so the throttles wouldn't work. We'd never know if the throttles were working or not, of course. But again, it's remotely possible. We can never say never in terms of electronics, but very unlikely. Now, we have talked about the facts. So none of these systems or the flaps didn't fail, the landing gear was down deliberately. The fuel cutoff switches, they cannot be moved or operated on a whim, you know, like accidentally. And they've always been like this for every single Boeing that's ever been designed. A modern airliner, I mean, not, you know, Boeing has designed a lot of planes without these features, but any modern airliner from the 707 to these days have some sort of locking mechanism for the fuel control because it's critical. It's something that you can just press it and completely shuts an engine down. Now, this brings us to one of the very many questions have been raised, but there are a couple of questions. Is why can the pilots, deactivate both engines by cutting off their fuel, and why is it positioned here in such a way the pilots can accidentally move them? We're seeing about that accidental movement being almost impossible. And even if you did do one, you would never do to the two of them by accident. I don't know what condition a pilot could ever come here and accidentally pull the knob down, but let's say they can mistake this for the parking brake, for example, or this would happen on the ground, or the fire discharge or something like that, which eventually, if you need to discharge the fire extinguisher on an engine, you most likely will cut off power anyway. Well, then the other question is, why are the pilots able to turn off both engines like this? Wasn't there like a fail-safe mechanism to prevent this? Like, say, if you're on a takeoff roll, could you shut off just one and the other will be locked? Well, no. Consider this, and I've mentioned this to a friend recently. Consider that there is an actual dual bird strike on the engine. So let's say I'm taking off here on a Metadub, and there are a big flock of birds. Both engines are killed or at least heavily damaged by a bird strike. There's fire on the engines. I need to shut off these two valves here. You would say, but that would kill your engines. Well, guess what? The birds already did that. I don't need to worry about fuel unless, of course, I need to cut off that fuel to prevent a fire. Let's say I have a dual bird strike and I'm taking off, dual bird strike. Both engines are killed. I have fire on those engines, which are still being drenched in fuel. I need to cut off those engines pretty fast. Why? Well, maybe I cannot land the plane again, but at least I can prevent a fire if I do manage to land the plane. As remote as it can be, and we know that this plane was unable to land again, but you know, you need to have the ability to turn off the engine power immediately in the case of emergency, which brings us to the QRH. So I know this has been a bit boring, but I think we're talking about very important stuff, and we'll talk about some other less boring stuff. Not fun, but less boring, at least we will for sure. So let's go back to our PDF file here. Sorry about that. So let's talk about the emergency procedures. Now, I'm not going to bore you with this, but I'm going to show you the Boeing 787 Quick Reference Handbook, or QRH, which has been talked about a lot, but not a lot of people really know what this is all about. So this is the Quick Reaction or Quick Reference Handbook. And this tells you, I believe this is incomplete to be honest, but this tells you what major incidents on board can happen, and almost all planes around the world have the QRH, or at least the airliner or the commercial operator ones do have. Military aircraft also have a quick reference handbook, at least in the Western world. I'm not going to talk about generally speaking all over the world, but you know, this is the quick reference handbook in case an emergency happens on board. And there's an index here for abbreviation to help pilots guide themselves. So let's say we are talking about an aborted engine start, cabin altitude, and dual engine fail or stall. What does this tell you? So this is the procedures designed by Boeing to recover a plane in case of a dual engine failure, which was exactly what we had with this Flight 171. So the first thing the pilots need to do, and this is supposed to be straightforward, this is supposed not to be any kind of, you know, complicated stuff. The pilots need this to be quick and be reasonable. And so the first thing they need to do is fuel control switches, cut off then run. So the pilots on this flight, they didn't have much to do with this because the cutoff switches apparently were already off. But still, whoever ran the QRH, probably the pilot not flying, not sure who it was on this flight, ran the QRH. So as soon as he saw there was a problem on board, the pilot popped up, probably on his electronic flight bag, he popped up the QRH and started running through this checklist. So instead of cut off and run, he probably looked at the switches and just set them to run. Now notice that there's no indication that this is engine 1 or engine 2, right? So it's a dual engine start, but Boeing here deliberately says fuel control switches both from cut off then run. And this is exactly whoever was running the QRH did, as we saw in the preliminary report. Let's go back there. It says here that after this happened, the fuel cutoff switch transitioned for cutoff to run, and then about 4 seconds or 4 seconds later, the other one was sent from cutoff switch to also cutoff to run. So they were running the QRH almost certainly. And then there's the RAT, the ram air turbine. Now, unfortunately, this plane here does not have a functional ram air turbine, but you can see it here. This is the switch. This is a glass guard here, just like this one. So this glass should open, and then you should, or the pilot should, press the ram air turbine switch to deploy it. And as you saw earlier in the report, we saw the picture of the plane right here, and you can see that this is exactly what the pilot did, or whoever was running the QRH, and it apparently did it very fast, very quickly, because this happened right after rotation, a few seconds after rotation, and so he did it very quickly. Why the plane while the plane was already airborne, so we know this is after V2. So there was a decision to take off, and then the fuel cutoff switches were moved and the QRH was set. So the pilots were doing a great job following the QRH instance after the malfunction was identified, which is something to praise. And then let's go back to the QRH. After this, airspeed above 250 knots. Now this they did not have. Were not above 250. We know that this happened at 180. So even if there was some residual inertia, 250 knots, it was probably not. Why the speed? Well, Boeing explains this ensures the best windmill start capability. So this airspeed allows the engines to continue running because of the engine of the air running through the engine. Ensure it will windmill it, so like a windmill, and allow the startup to occur. And then APU selector, start, then on. And we saw in the report the APU inlet was open, so we know that they did press the APU to start. After all this, there was nothing more they could have done. So the QRH tells them that, they explain that the engine may accelerate to idle very slowly because remember the engines are spooling down, they're shutting down. So in order to be accelerated to idle power, this could have. We will try to do that in the next flight. It will take some time for them to come out of decelerate to accelerate idle. And they claim here that slow acceleration may be incorrectly interpreted as a hung start or engine malfunction. But there are ways to figure that one out. This is, of course, irrelevant. They never get to this. The only thing they saw was probably, we don't know, but the only thing they probably saw was the engine 1 being spooled up and the engine 2 trying to spool up as well before the unfortunate event that ended this flight. Also pay attention that the primary flight computers, they need to be disconnected and reconnected. This is of course in a very standard procedure. This is of course if the dual engine fail do come back to life, because dual engine failure they may as well not come back to life. So again, the QRH is to tell you, all right, something happened, let's try this or that. And then you can go through the engine auto start left and right, trying to again turn on the power on, let's say an auto start failed to start the engine. None of this applies. The only thing that I think would apply would be the dual engine fail stall. Engine stall was not the case in this point. It was an engine failure. So this is what the QRH says, and then of course this needs to be complemented by the flight crew operation manual COM for the 787, which will not go into that here. It's out of the point, but the idea is to turn on, relight the engines. Actually, the pilots were doing their job, so they were competent to that point. Again, we don't know what made the two switches being turned off, but at least it's clear to everybody from the preliminary report that the pilots were doing their job to recover the plane, and they did so to their best abilities. So coming back to our 787, I'm not, the point is not to show you the mishap. I don't think it's relevant to show you the mishap. Again, you can say whatever you want about these pilots. I think they were courageous to some point. Again, I'm not sure what happened to have the power cutoff switches being set, but we can only assume it was a mishap, probably a malfunction on the plane. We just don't know. So let's put the flaps back to 5, and let's do. I don't have any flights set up here. This is the similar airport. I just want to debunk something real quick. regarding the airport itself. People claimed, because of air nav data, that the plane never backtracked, because they see on the air nav that the plane was taxiing out of the gate and entered this holding point here, and then the air nav data just shows the plane taking, well, the air nav data actually doesn't show anything about the taxi moment. It just shows the plane transponder being on at halfway around from the runway. So it looks like in the very first instances people were talking about the airport, that the airplane took off mid runway. That's not true. Later on, AirNav corrected that information, and they said no, the plane did backtrack all the way down to the beginning of this runway, and it took off from that runway. In this case, it's runway. Sorry about that. There's it's runway 23. So there's the little maneuvering area here where the plane would just backtrack and then turn around for runway 23 and take off. Now, if Flight Simulator placed this plane very far ahead, but we are, as we know, as we've come to realize, the plane did take off almost around the letters, so somewhere where those yellow lines end, and not here where my plane is at the moment. But welcome to Flight Simulator, just almost puts me almost in the middle of the runway. Anyway, so let's attempt to recreate this. Again, this is not to be an exhaustive procedure. This plane does not have a ram air turbine model, so I cannot try to deploy the RAT. What the ram air turbine, so let's talk about the ram air turbine, and I'll show you how it works in another plane I have. But the ram air turbine enables the pilot to have primary hydraulic and electrical systems, so only the pilot will get the PFD and ND working. As you'll see, when we switch off the engines, we'll effectively switch off power generation for the aircraft. So that means that we'll no longer have most of the functions on board. The only thing that stays lit is the upper ACUS, or in this airplane there is only one ACUS, so the only thing that will be continuing to work is the second MFD, which includes ACUS. Everything, and I believe the CDUs will also be active. Anything else will be turned off, including the heads-up display. This one has, but I don't think Air India had it on their planes. But in any case, the ram air turbine, when deployed, will guarantee continuous hydraulic control as well as electric control to one of the buses. I'm not entirely sure which one it is, but I think it's the primary for the pilot. So I think it's C1 and for the hydraulics, and also primary and demand for left side. Not sure about the right side, not entirely sure. It's irrelevant. What you need to know is that the pilot, the commander, the pilot captain, will have the ram air turbine will supply him with enough power to operate the plane, and as long as the RAT is windmilling. So it looks like a propeller, and it is a propeller, and there's a small generator in it that allows power to be driven to these two electric and hydraulic systems. This airplane, unfortunately, this is the freeware Horizon 787. It's good up to a point, but it then fails to provide some in-depth systems, so it's not a study level plane if you want. It's almost a study level plane. So I can't show you the RAT here, but I'll show you on another plane right after this demo, and we'll see how much time let's turn off the HUD. How much time did these pilots actually had? And I'm sure I'm going to fail where they excelled for two reasons. Number one, I'm not a pilot. I don't fly this plane that often, 787, and I'm solo, so I'm missing a co-pilot here. But we will accelerate to 153 knots or close to that, rotate, and then at 180 knots after V2, we'll switch off both engines with the same cadence as the flight report, as the crash report says. So it's about 1 second, and we'll see how much time we have, and we'll see how, well, how daunting of a task these pilots would have, and how unfortunate it was that it happened so low. They didn't have enough time. We'll see. So here we go. So let's add power. We're gonna take off with full thrust here. I think we're paused, aren't we? Okay. Something's not happening, which is typical on Flight Simulator. Alright, let's try again. Alright. We've been here for so long, I think we hit a wall here. Some bug. Parking brake is off. Sounds okay. Not sure why we're stuck. This is active pause. We're out of active pause. Let's try again. It's okay. We can just restart the flight. No worries. Always happening. Something happens to my stream all the time. Alright, here we go again. So flaps 5 are set. Parking brakes are off. And let's go. Now we're moving. Yeah, there was definitely something wrong with... Let's go toga. So, here we go. Airspeed alive. 60 knots. $100. So the plane was kind of heavy, but we'll... Here we go. 150 rotate. We're airborne. No gear up, remember that. And now as the plane is accelerating, we'll hit 180 knots and then fuel cutoff 1, 2. Alright, this is exactly what happens. Alright, so plane's still flying. Now this is the point where the rat would be deployed, but we don't have a rat. So the ram air turbine did not deploy. So let's now add a reaction time. Let's try to reactivate the engines. Let's start by windmilling number 1. Remember, we don't have a ram air turbine. 2. There's no spooling up. Okay, and we have crashed. Of course, these are taller buildings than the area where the plane crashed. But you get the idea. So there was no time. I have no crash turn on the simulator. So there was no time for an honest reaction. In order for the engines to recover, let's say engine number 1 does recover, you would probably need around 15 seconds for it to spool up and be ready to operation, maybe less, but you have to consider that you also need pilot reaction time. And I think my simulator just crashed, which is always nice. Let's wait a little longer. It apparently crashed. Oh no, there it goes. Yeah, it did crash, but went back to the main menu. It wasn't what I wanted. Anyway, the point is, you have to consider reaction time, not just, oh, I know. It's exactly what Captain Soley encountered in his trial. So in this trial, the accusation was saying, oh, but we ran these tests on a simulator, and pilots were able to recover the plane. They didn't have to land on the water in the River Hudson. And Sully was really, to the point. Yes, but they knew they were going to have a dual engine malfunction on that Airbus 320. Put them on a situation they don't know what's going to happen, and you have to rely on reaction time. That's the reason why Captain Sully made his decisions. He had to react to the situation as it was happening. It was not told the engines would turn off. The same thing would happen here on this particular flight. The pilots were, of course, not aware that these two engines would die, or at least one of the pilots wasn't, if we are still going with that story about ill intent, which, again, we just don't know. But let's imagine one of the pilots did have ill intent and did try to sabotage the flight. The other pilot didn't know about it, so he had to react to what was happening. And if it's true, and the other pilot said, I did not do it, and if it's true he didn't do anything, then again, both pilots had to react to the situation. One pilot needed to pick up the QRH, then ran the QRH. The other pilot needed to continue to hold the plane because he couldn't pick up anything. He couldn't start reading the QRH. The other pilot had to do that. So that leads me to believe that there was no ill intent. Something happened, and again, the pilots reacted as professionals. They deploy the rat, they turn on the one of the engines and the other one. They were doing exactly what the QRH said, as you saw earlier. So it is unfortunate that this tragic event occurred so low, so near the ground. It gives us so many questions, right? Why would someone with the intent of sabotage do that at that point, right? Like, they were taking off. Why would someone just pull the switches to cut off? Just, there's a slight chance that pilots could actually make it. That whoever did that, I mean, deliberately, it just doesn't ring in my head. I'm sorry. There are people that are into conspiracy theories. I'm not one of them. I cannot see that way. Now, to end this, I'm just going to show you what a ram air turbine looks like. And like I said, this plane does not have one, but I'll show you on another one. Sorry, yeah, I was in the right place. It's developer mode. So I'll show you another plane. Let's hope this doesn't oh, hold on. Cancel the takeoff. So let's pick the competition. Let's pick the competition here. How's it name? Builds probably. So it's not where's builds? It's not here. All right, so if it's not here, we'll just go back to main menu. Sorry about that. The ram air turbine, like I was saying, is how beautiful. This is Sintra Castle in Portugal, just for those that don't know it. The ram air turbine, again, supplies essential power to the main or one of the hydraulic systems, as well as one of the electrical systems. So let's do it with the competition, like I was saying, which is builds. I probably passed by it and didn't see it, so apologies for that, but should be fairly quick to load this plane in any case. I'm going to show you on the A350, not just because it has a ram air turbine, but it's because it's actually a very similar plane to the 787. And we'll talk about, to end this, we'll talk about what are the standards for the aviation. So what is a ram air turbine? We talked about this several times. Let's finally look at it and talk about it a little bit. Here we go. And let's talk about how it actually works. Now on the Airbus, we're gonna have to wait a little bit. On the Airbus, we do not have to deploy the RAT manually. the system will deploy it as soon as it encounters an issue with either hydraulic or electrical generation from the engine. So it's a little bit different than the Boeing, that you need to press that button to deploy it, and we'll see it in action. And I'm sure you'll agree it's a fairly weird looking thing, but it can save lives. So let's just wait for the OIS to become available so I can load everything up. And I apologize in advance. I need to make another flight on the A350. This is a very cool airplane. This one is study level, unlike the previous Horizon 787. Here we go. So let's go to our panel states, sorry. And let's make it ready for takeoff. It's gonna start everything up real quick. It's already deploying flaps 1, which is equivalent to Boeing's flap 5 for departure. So let's just wait for the engines to spool up. All right. We need to wait a little bit. So as you can see here, the switches on the Airbus, we were talking about that early on. The switches on the Airbus do not have that locking mechanism, but in order to operate, we do need to pull up and back, just like the Boeing one. So you can see it's a standard in the world of aviation. They also have the fire warning lit up on the engine, so that pilots know exactly if there's a fire, which one is really on fire. All right, we got engine 1, number 2 is coming up. Sorry, we need to start up the engines here at this moment, but this plane is set to start with the engines off. All right, so let's do the same thing, but in this case I don't want to crash, because it's pointless to crash, just to show you how it works. And I'm going to show you what the rat looks like and what kind of power I have. So let's go to, you will probably get some takeoff warning. Let's see. Yeah, okay, we're gonna go MCT 84 knots, it's enough. $150, rotate, more or less at the same position. And now, let's cut off the engines and let's look outside. So, engine number 1 cut off, engine number 2 cut off.
Too low, terrain.
Alright, so first thing we hear is a too low terrain, and there's the rat. Let's pause here. We can see the little rat there. Alright, so this is what both the 787 and the Dreamliner 787 and the Airbus A350 have. And as you can see, the rats will deploy automatically, unlike the Boeing that you have to press a button. And on the Airbus, you can also see that the APU is automatically starting up. Another thing that the Boeing pilots didn't have available was the auto's APU start. So when both engines fail for some reason, the rat deploys and the APU will automatically turn on. This is just to show you what you have on board. Now, what do I have on board with the rat? Let's guarantee that the APU isn't feeding power. This is what I got with the rat deployed. So on the A350, I'm not sure this would happen, to be honest. I'm not sure the co-pilot would have PFD and ND, but the pilot, the captain does have PFD and ND, and as well as ECAM and one of the CDUs. The second CDU isn't available, and I honestly, and the OIS, so the electronic flight bags aren't available, but I'm almost sure the co-pilot will also not have PFD and ND. But we'll just take the word from Inibuilds. So this leads me to believe that because only the captain's side had PFD and ND on the Boeing, he would immediately take control for the sake of just having the primary flight display and the navigation display available to him and not the co-pilot. Again, I could be wrong. There could be a chance the RAT could supply to them both, as we apparently can see here for the 350. Again, I don't believe it, but don't take my word for it. You can easily research for that. But the point here is, I think the captain took control if he wasn't already pilot flying. If he was pilot flying, he would just continue taking control of the plane. If he was pilot not flying, he would monitor and run the QRH, but I honestly believe he took control because of the fact that the RAT usually only supplies power to the left side. Again, this is irrelevant. Unfortunately, either pilots could be pilot flying and the other running the QRH. What's important to note here is that they were running the QRH, and those are memory items. You know, the turning on the relit, the engines, and the ram air turbine deployment button, which in this plane isn't necessary. As you can see, now I have APU bleed, and now I also have APU power, so probably now the plane systems electrics can come back on for the co-pilot side as well, but not sure Inibuilds did an oopsie here and just allow the RAT to supply the co-pilot. I could be wrong. Don't start bashing on me. So at the end of the day, as my final words, this video is a bit longer than I thought it would be. My thoughts and prayers go to the families of those who perished, of course. I'm not going to pass judgment whether or not they did a good job or not. I do know that they were doing their job running the QRH, and that much I've said. I don't feel like they're incompetent people that just press on switches. I don't know any pilot that would be incompetent to that level, whether they're from India, United States, Portugal, or whatever. They're highly trained people around the world. There are also international standards for these people, so it's not like they're going to put anybody on board flying any plane. And you know, there could be a mishap. There could be an incident on board. There could be a sleeve getting stuck. I mean, it's possible. But look at this. These are sturdy switches on the A350. As you saw on the the 787, these are sturdy switches. And when they're on, they are placed in such a way with this stopper here that it's kind of hard to pull them up unintentionally. You can't hardly see the animation here, but you can see that they need to be pulled to operate, just like the Boeing one. And you know, you can say a lot of things about Air India. We talked about that in the beginning, where passengers claim that Air India standards have been dropped over the years with their planes dirty, their malfunctions on board. This particular plane had a couple of MELs, so missing equipment list, failures, but nothing relevant to the flight. If I'm not mistaken, it was something in the cabin, nothing serious. So the planes apparently are being well kept. Otherwise, they won't fly internationally. As you know, the rules are very strict over European airspace and so on. So to say that, well, India had a malfunction, they didn't repair their malfunctions, blah blah blah, that's something that the final report can say. And I'm not saying that's not possible, but in order to respect both the people that lost their lives but also the investigators that are conducting their work, let's not go into that. Regarding the facts, both switches were switched off one after the other. That caused engine starvation from fuel. They both stopped. There was not enough altitude below 600 feet. They didn't have time to react, but still they ran the QRH. Still they tried to relight both engines. So whatever happened that made those fuel cutoff switches is what the main investigation should be focused. But now you know, fuel cutoff switches do kill the engines. They're intended to do that. They're designed to do that. They're designed to give the pilot the power to do so in the case of an emergency. They need to be deliberately actioned. However, in the 787, it's an entire module, so it's quite possible that for some reason the entire module failed. However unlikely that may be, and yeah, we need to respect the investigation. Hope for the best. Hope that we can know the truth. But let's close on a very personal opinion of mine, and this is the only opinion you will ever get from this case. Uh, it's quite possible the final report will not be made public. Let's pause here. It's quite possible. I'm not saying that's... Oh, it's overspeeding. Are you not going to shut up? All right. It's quite possible that the main report might not be made public. I hope it is, for the sake of the world of aviation. The fact that there were no service bulletins, or some update from the engine or the Boeing, from the engine developer and from Boeing out there after the event, makes me believe that there was no malfunction present, or at least noticeable, on the plane itself. Okay, sorry for the crash, it's unintentional. But what I mean is, it's quite possible that there was a malfunction, but there was no service bulletin, there was no information out there regarding that. So I'm pretty sure that the report will be made public, but if not, it's probably because, I'm not saying it's covering anything, but it might be a little too sensitive for the families involved and all that. But that's it's a possibility. They just don't release the final report. But the preliminary report is very, very clear. What caused the accident was fuel starvation to both engines, caused by a fuel control switches being set to cut off one after the other. And that is strange on its own. Anyway, this was a bit different from what we are used to here on this channel. I hope that I was able to help people, at least be aware of these facts. If you're interested, I can share the preliminary report, but it's very well documented online. It's available if you Google it. The QRH, I'm sorry I can't share it, but you saw what you saw. It's also public. You can search for it, but I don't like sharing aircraft documentation online for which I don't have permission to share. So I showed you the QRH because it's a publicly available document. You can search and find it yourself. Regarding the preliminary report is available. The final report, we should be waiting for it about a year from now. It usually takes that time because these reports often investigate, the backgrounds of the pilots, the backgrounds of the maintenance of this aircraft and the others, the procedures, company standard operating procedures, blah, blah, blah. Even they go as far as explaining the pilot's medical report. So we know that both pilots ran a sobriety test before the flight, and they both checked okay. So All those things need to be considered, and then the final report should be issued with recommendations. Whatever these recommendations will be, they could be for the pilots, they could be for the airlines, they could even be for Boeing. We don't know. But for the time being, please don't speculate. This is what the report said. I've shown you as to my best abilities how these planes work, how these systems work, the ram air turbine, the fuel cutoff switches, how it's impossible to have been an accident or crude pilot's misbehavior, for example. And I hope that you understand that whenever these accidents occur, aviation learns. And this is the only positive thing that could be taken from aircraft and accidents and incidents. Aviation always tries to learn, and the best way is sharing the knowledge. Remember that. And one final note for those that are a bit afraid to fly these days: flying is still safe. I've said this over and over. Don't be afraid to fly if you need to take a flight somewhere. The possibility of you having an incident is extremely low. It's actually more, you've heard this before. I'm not telling you something new, but it's most likely, it's more probable that you have a car accident or that you fall from your own stairs on your own house than having an airplane accident. And even a fatal one is even rarer. So don't be afraid to fly because of these things. Pilots are heavily trained. Airplanes have huge redundancies. Even the 787 has a pristine service list with zero fatal accidents until this one. And yeah, don't be afraid to fly and don't be afraid of aviation. And remember, always ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask them. Don't take things for face value. Even what I said here, please, if you have something against it, if you need to ask further questions, please do so. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I'm not sure how many participants I still have. I see probably Mirsha is still around. So Mirsha and Jenny, I suppose. Thank you for coming from the chat. Again, if you have any question, you or anybody else, feel free to ask in the comments of this live stream. The video will be available for the next few days, and I thank you all for coming. Please leave a like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.